everyone. Before I begin, I want you to remember the last time someone made you feel truly understood. Maybe it was a friend who noticed that you were quieter than usual, or a teacher who asked you if you were all right, or maybe even a doctor or a stranger who in that moment made you feel truly understood. Now think about the opposite. A time when a conversation felt rushed, mechanical, you felt distant. Now, these times you walked away thinking, did they even care about me? What if I told you that the difference between those two moments is not personality but pressure? And this brings me to something I want all of us to try together. I'm going to be presenting 3 statements. I need you to point out the 2 truths and 1 lie. You can usually tell within seconds if someone truly cares about you. Stress can even make the kindest of a person feel distant. Empathy is purely an individual trait, completely unaffected by surrounding systems. Take a moment. Which one of you, by a show of hands, can you tell me, do you think it's statement number 3, the lie? Can you raise your hands, please? Thank you. It is. And we still live it as though it were true. How quick are we to sometimes judge people as cold or emotionally unavailable without ever questioning the kind of conditions that they might be surviving in? So let me share an instance with you. With a family member, I once visited a hospital. The doctor walked in. He barely looked at us, barely asked us any questions, and he left. I almost felt offended because the conversation felt so mechanical. And what happened next is something that was so amusing. I stepped out and I saw 20 more patients waiting. So the question in my mind immediately flipped. Instead of asking whether the doctor simply lacked empathy, I found myself wondering, were they simply just overwhelmed? That moment, it asked me to question something I had always just assumed, that empathy is purely an individual trait. Think about yourselves during an extremely busy exam season. So you have internal assessments, you've got predicted grades in your mind, you need to cater to extracurricular responsibilities and leadership roles. You're still the same person, but do you think you're as patient with your friends? Do you think you're as emotionally available with your family? Probably not, right? I have spent a lot of time thinking about the kind of doctor that I want to become. And naturally, I came to the conclusion that I want to be an empathetic one. But the real question was, what kind of a doctor does this system allow me to become? Let me share an instance with you. So I recently shadowed this doctor in the United Kingdom, and I witnessed something extremely powerful. Now, it wasn't a life-changing diagnosis or an extremely massive conversation. It was just a nurse speaking to an elderly patient with dementia. This patient was feeling extremely anxious. They wanted to go home because they wanted to take care of their pet dog. It would have been so incredibly easy to just dismiss that concern, to say, don't worry about it, and move on. But instead, the nurse leaned in and gently asked the patient, how old was he? What did he look like? What was his favorite food? The thing that struck me most was not only the nurse's kindness, it was the fact that she had the time and the emotional space to be able to notice what mattered to the patient in that particular moment. We observe that in healthcare structures in India, the ability to holistically care for a patient is often sidelined because of the many systemic issues that are present. So these issues are basically barring doctors from being able to devote that kind of time and presence to their patients. Let's talk about these issues for a bit. Medicine today, it functions in an environment of relentless pressure. So you have long working hours, overnight duties, emergency calls at impossible hours, shifts that are supposed to last 12 hours but often just extend far beyond that. On top of overcrowded wards, understaffing, and limited resources. Yet, we expect doctors to step into every patient interaction with the same compassion, the same patience, and the same energy. This pressure is not an isolated issue. I want to tell you what it looks like in real time. So I was speaking with this medical student at GMC, which is one of the most prestigious medical colleges in India. She told me that she once had to cover an additional 72-hour shift. That's right, 3 entire days. And within this time, she was only offered 6 hours of break. Not 6 hours of sleep, 6 hours of total break. She was made to sleep on a hard floor, not even a proper bed. And sometimes, she even had to sleep next to corpses in the same room. I want all of you to ask yourself this question. How do we expect empathy to survive in this kind of exhaustion and these kind of working conditions? Because when I began thinking about it this way, this isolated issue was no longer isolated. It pointed towards something that was symptoms of something much larger. So just a few months ago, the Indigo pilot fatigue crisis occurred. Thousands of flights were cancelled because there were new regulations around the mandatory pilot rest. We're talking about nearly 4,500 flights being cancelled and the entire country accepting the reasoning behind it. Exhausted pilots should not be flying aircrafts because lives are at stake. And rightly so. But then why doesn't this same logic apply to medicine as well? Recent research has shown that nearly 1 in 4 doctors in India experience burnout. And this is especially prevalent in younger doctors and those that work longer shifts. In such kind of conditions, it becomes impossible to empathize with someone. What actually happens is that when you've cared continuously for so long under so much pressure, your emotional reserves begin to run dry. It's not that you stop caring, it's just that you don't have the ability to keep expressing that care in the same way. Think about yourselves when you pull an all-nighter. You're tired, you can't concentrate, and the last thing you want to be doing is going out of your way and helping somebody. This is because empathy requires that kind of cognitive and emotional bandwidth. It requires you to listen actively, to notice those non-verbal cues, to be able to register somebody else's fear. All of it, while also being able to emotionally regulate yourself. And the issue is that this kind of sleep deprivation or burnout directly affects your brain regions that are responsible for carrying out these particular functions. So I'm talking about the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. These 2 brain regions are responsible for judgment, patience, and emotional regulation. So what we're looking at is a neurological consequence of prolonged exhaustion. I think that this exhaustion is deeply shaped by what the system chooses to award. Medicine today is simply just about numbers. Oh, how many patients were seen? How quickly did rounds move? How efficiently were consultations done? And naturally, when these are the only metrics that matter, speed becomes priority. But medicine is not only about throughput. What if quality of interaction mattered just as much as quantity? What if being listened to, feeling reassured, And receiving that kind of emotional care became a part of how hospitals assessed performance. Because what gets measured gets prioritized. And that is the irony at the heart of the system. So we see that in a lot of Indian government hospitals and outpatient departments, more than 1,000 patients are seen in a single day. And this leaves very few minutes for each consultation, right? We expect doctors to provide deeply personalized, high-quality care, yet we place them in environments that suggest otherwise. We ask for compassion, but we reward speed. We're asking for patience and presence, but we're just creating pressure. I want you to sit with this thought for a minute. Success in society is often measured by how many marks you got or how many universities offered you a place. But it's never about, oh, I learned something new along the way, or oh, I grew as an individual and matured. How can quality ever truly be achieved when quantity is the only thing that the system is built around? And now because these structures are so hyper-focused on output, consequences do not end when consultations do. They inevitably spill into the lives of people working within it. Now, doctors aren't machines. They're only humans, right? But they're asked to sacrifice so many parts of their lives because of the field's demands. I don't know how many of you know this, but after they're done with their patient interactions and consultations, they spend a lot of time completing paperwork and documentation and updating patient records. So their work extends deep into the night, often behind a screen. It makes it impossible for them to separate work from personal life. And I think this at a very small scale reminds me of my college application journey. And I'm sure a lot of you all would be able to relate. There's tons to do. Your grades have to be perfect. You have to volunteer, take up leadership roles. You're trying to build this perfect profile to get into your dream college. But think about it. Do you think that you're still as patient? Do you think you're still being able to make time for your social life? You're still trying to be a person, right? So if even we, as students, find our empathy shrink under pressure, imagine what that feels like after a 72-hour shift. And that is why I think all of us need to rethink the claim that empathy is simply just an individual quality, and we need to address the elephant in the room. Now, only when we question these structures can we come at redesigning them and finding solutions. So when I thought about solutions, the first thing that came into my mind was giving back doctors the one thing that systems take away from them: time. This is where technology becomes a powerful enabler rather than a replacement. So certain tasks like administrative paperwork or case notes, updating patient records, all of these are processes that take up a lot of time. And doctors, they spend a lot of time doing these works instead of spending time with their patients. So if AI can take over these repetitive processes, doctors actually get respite, which translates into better patient outcome. If I tell you about a few of the initiatives that our government has also taken, which is consistent with the motto of the Ayushman Bharat Health Mission, which is to make healthcare accessible for everyone. So what they did is that they came up with this data-enabled network app, which is essentially going to securely transfer and maintain patient data. I think it's so important for us as citizens to appreciate, support, and encourage these efforts. All in all, I think if we employ these kind of technological advances, we are reducing the workload and the burnout that doctors experience. And this means that better care, because doctors are no longer spending time on rudimentary tasks. But the thing is that time alone is not enough. Think about what gets you through a difficult week. It could just be a friend checking in or someone asking if you're all right. That kind of a supportive environment changes everything. This brings me to the emotional labor within medicine. Systems often just assume that doctors absorb everything going on around them. I was speaking to a pediatrician who told me that she had seen babies gasping for their lives, children who had been abused in unimaginable manners, and she'd had to tell a joyous little girl that she had cancer. I couldn't help but imagine how emotionally taxing that might be. How do you cope with that without all of these big emotions doing any kind of harm to you? That's why it's so important to set up a system wherein doctors feel comfortable enough to be able to seek help whenever they need it. Because they're also just humans, again. Their mental health matters as well. Think about it. How can you extend empathy to other people when you're not being able to do that to yourself? And this is where I want to talk about the stem, the root of this issue. I think if we make changes in how medicine is taught, this is where the most meaningful change can occur. So I came across a protocol called the Spikes protocol. This is how doctors break bad news to patients. And I found this particularly interesting because it helps us also while having difficult conversations with loved ones. So what I saw is a doctor trying to tell an old, frail lady that she had a life-changing disease. Let's see how this was done. So firstly, the doctor picked an extremely quiet setting. He asked the lady, "How have you been doing? Why do you think you've come in today?" He slightly hinted at the fact that bad news was incoming, and he asked her, "Would you be comfortable discussing it then?" Only after a go-ahead did he begin to give her the nitty-gritties of the disease and discussed an effective treatment plan. What stood out to me is that he gave her the emotional space to be able to process her emotions. He made her feel comfortable enough to ask him any kind of questions or alleviate any confusions that may occur. And I think this particular protocol needs to be mandated. More than 99% doctors at some point in their careers have to break bad news to either a patient or to a patient's family. But in India, only 30% follow this protocol. Medical education focuses so much on, how to quickly identify a disease or how to be on your feet and efficient at your job. But rarely do we teach them how to look at the person behind the pathology. So I just want to thank all of you for riding with me on this journey as we look at the truth behind what stress does to you, and we unravel this lie and this myth that empathy is purely an individual quality. Because trust me, this is extremely relevant in situations even beyond the hospital wards. How many times have you thought that someone was lazy or cold or uncaring without ever questioning the kind of environments that they might be surviving in? Maybe what we call personality is simply just pressure. Maybe indifference is exhaustion. And maybe empathy is something, not something that we just have or we lose. Maybe the systems that we're in protect it or cause it to slowly erode. I think all of us at some point in our lives are going to enter into systems as future professionals, as leaders, as individuals who are going to be shaping workplace and institutions. the important question is not only what kind of a person do we want to become, but rather what kind of a system do we go on to build? Because we're often too quick to diagnose people, but far too slow to diagnose the systems behind them. Thank you.